The moment Ethan stepped into the diner, something felt strangely out of place for a man used to conference rooms made of glass and steel. This tiny place with flickering neon signs had nothing to do with the world the title of his life usually carried. Yet here he was, ordering the cheapest meal on the menu like someone trying to disappear. The waitress smiled at him with simple kindness, not recognizing the billionaire behind the plain jacket. And that alone set off a quiet storm inside him. He watched her move around the room, checking on tired cooks, bringing extra napkins to a dishwasher taking his break, offering each person a warm word like it cost her nothing. It made him wonder how such a modest place could breathe the unity his own company kept bragging about, but never really lived. His fork barely touched the plate as he focused on the tiny details, the things that didn't match the reports he kept receiving. The deeper he looked, the more he felt that this diner held something he wasn't finding in the empire he built. Then Maya picked up his small tip, and instead of slipping it into her pocket like most would, she walked toward the back with a seriousness that caught his attention, making him forget his cooling food and lean forward to see where she was going. Ethan watched Maya step to a shelf near the service station, where a locked jar sat almost hidden behind a stack of old menus. The label, handwritten in black marker, read, "Night Crew," and she placed the small tip inside as if it were a treasure meant for someone who never gets thanked. She whispered something to a co-worker, and the words drifted through the air just clear enough for him to catch. The dishwashers deserve to feel seen too. That simple sentence dug under his ribs, cracking open expectations he didn't even know he still carried. His executives preached about unity, about culture, about company values written in polished slides, yet here was a waitress in a small-town diner practicing more genuine leadership than anyone in his own headquarters. He felt admiration rise slowly, mixed with confusion at how easily she gave away something she earned. The more he watched her, the more he felt as if someone had quietly lifted a corner of a curtain he had avoided pulling back. If kindness like this existed in a place with no budget meetings or culture committees, what did it say about everything happening in his own business? The question lingered heavy and sharp, pushing him to look deeper at a life he had been too busy to question. Sitting alone in that booth, Ethan could almost hear the polished voices of his executives, echoing their weekly promises about a workplace built on respect. Yet Maya's gesture was a quiet challenge to every graph they had shown him. He remembered the last meeting, the confident smiles, the rehearsed lines, and suddenly there was doubt swirling like a storm. He began to suspect that the perfect numbers were simply too perfect, shaped to impress rather than reveal. A sting of guilt settled in his chest as he wondered how long he had allowed the illusion to stand without digging deeper. His eyes drifted across the diner, noticing the dishwasher from earlier rubbing tired eyes and stretching sore arms, and something inside Ethan twisted. Then a co-worker muttered under their breath about how corporate folks don't care, and even though the comment wasn't aimed at him, it landed with weight he couldn't hide from. It made him question just how deep the problem went and whether he had been blind to it all along. The thought followed him like a shadow, growing with every heartbeat, forcing him to face truths he had quietly avoided for years. As he continued watching Maya, he saw another moment that struck him even harder. A cook dropped a tray, sending utensils clattering, and she rushed to help without hesitation, speaking to him with kindness instead of frustration. There was no audience, no incentive, no performance for tips. It was simply who she was. Ethan felt the contrast settle into him with uncomfortable clarity. His company loved to talk about empathy, but it had been reduced to slogans. Maya, on the other hand, lived it without thinking. He realized that exposing the truth would pull apart more than numbers. It could threaten powerful people who were comfortable controlling the narrative. That fear pressed down on him, a pressure he wasn't ready to voice. Yet the longer he stayed, the clearer it became that silence would only make him complicit in whatever was happening behind the scenes of his own empire. As he prepared to leave, he overheard a cook talking about company-wide cuts, rumored to come from his corporation, cuts he had never approved. The shock hit him so abruptly that it pushed the hesitation right out of him, leaving him balanced on the edge of a decision he could no longer avoid. By the time Ethan stepped out into the cool air outside the diner, his mind was burning with questions he needed answered. The warmth of Maya's kindness lingered in his thoughts, not because it was sweet, but because it felt like a mirror, reflecting everything his company had lost. His footsteps slowed as he realized he could no longer pretend he didn't know enough. If he continued running things based on polished lies, he would become the very problem he claimed to fight against, when he first built his business. The decision hardened quietly but firmly inside him. He would investigate every corner of the system without alerting the executives. It was a path with no return, but his conscience pushed him forward, refusing to let him look away. As he reached his car, his phone buzzed. A message from Victoria glowed on the screen. "We need to talk about the morale reports." The timing tightened something in his chest, confirming what instinct was already shouting. Whatever was happening inside his empire was bigger than he imagined, and now he had no choice but to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost. Before we dive into what Ethan is about to uncover, take 1 second to pause the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It helps keep this story alive, and it also creates a space where everyone who's feeling this moment can connect. Go ahead, pause and comment, and then come right back, because what's coming now starts opening the first real door into the truth Ethan fears the most. Ethan spent the entire morning replaying every detail of Maya's gesture, and the weight of it followed him all the way to his office. He had slipped into the building quietly, moving past familiar hallways with a different kind of purpose, one sharpened by doubt. As he sat down, the screen in front of him reflected a face that looked more tired than he wanted to admit, and yet more determined than ever. He pulled up internal files, the same ones he had approved countless times before without questioning, and began reading them with new eyes. The numbers seemed neat, far too neat, and once he started cross-checking bonuses and payouts against employee testimonies from previous reviews, patterns started appearing like cracks under fresh paint. Every page carried a small inconsistency, barely noticeable at first, but together they whispered that something was deeply wrong. His frustration grew as he saw the same missing entries repeated, the same signatures appearing in places that didn't match the dates, the same promises that never reached the people who needed them most. Tom, the HR manager, knocked softly before stepping inside, eyes lowered like someone walking into a confession they weren't ready to make. Ethan greeted him with a calm voice, trying to ease the tension in the air, and Tom sat down slowly, hands clasped. He spoke carefully at first, saying that some bonuses were delayed due to adjustments, then due to budgeting, then due to process issues. But each explanation sounded thinner than the last, and Ethan felt irritation rising, not because Tom was lying to protect himself, but because the fear behind his voice showed how deep the problem ran. When Tom finally exhaled shakily and admitted that many bonuses meant for low-level workers had never reached them at all, Ethan's stomach tightened. The words didn't come with drama, just a quiet truth that felt heavier than shouting. Tom added, almost in a whisper, that Victoria had been altering internal reports for years, smoothing out complaints, removing negative feedback, and rewriting numbers to make everything look healthier. Gratitude flickered briefly when Tom explained he couldn't keep pretending, and that Maya's kind of honesty was the reminder he needed to stop being silent. But mixed with it was a hard sting of betrayal that Ethan couldn't ignore. The more Tom revealed, the more Ethan felt his suspicion shifting into anger, not the explosive kind, but the kind that burned slow and steady, powered by disappointment. He couldn't understand how a system he built with the intention of fairness had been twisted into something that rewarded only the powerful. Tom reached into his bag with trembling fingers and pulled out a small drive, sliding it across the desk without making eye contact, as if the object itself carried guilt. Ethan stared at it for a long moment, feeling the room tighten around him. It was encrypted, Tom explained, not for safety, but because even storing the truth required protection inside an empire full of locked doors. That alone told Ethan how deep the deception went. The gratitude he felt toward Tom wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet recognition that speaking up came at a cost, and Tom had finally chosen the harder path. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting the drive like someone accepting responsibility rather than evidence. As Tom left the room, Ethan held the small device between his fingers, its weight far heavier than its size suggested. Everything he suspected from the diner was now unfolding in front of him, piece by piece, and this was only the beginning. The glow from his screen lit the encrypted folders as he inserted the drive, and for a moment he simply breathed, steadying himself. A quiet thought echoed in his mind, shaped by the truth he couldn't run from anymore. If this was just the first door, how many more had been locked on purpose, and what exactly was hidden behind them all? The files began to open, and with each line loading slowly across the screen, the sense grew stronger that he was stepping into something that would change everything, not only for his company, but for himself. Ethan stayed at his desk long after Tom left, staring at the encrypted folders slowly opening, like wounds he wasn't ready to look at. The files revealed line after line of budgets, trimmed so tightly that entire reward programs vanished without any explanation given to the workers who counted on them. Calculation notes showed how funds marked for bonuses had been rerouted under the excuse of improving quarterly performance, all signed off by people who once claimed to care about employee well-being. His chest tightened, as shock mixed with a kind of moral disgust he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a technical error. It was deliberate. Tom returned quietly, pulling a chair closer, and started explaining how each report had been polished before it ever reached Ethan. He spoke with a tone that shook between guilt and relief, as if letting the truth out was both terrifying and freeing. Ethan listened without interrupting, and when Tom apologized for staying silent for so long, something inside Ethan softened. Gratitude flickered through the frustration because Tom was choosing honesty now, even though it put him at risk. Ethan told him that owning up took courage, and the words seemed to lift some weight from Tom's shoulders, creating a small moment of understanding between them. The more they decoded, the more the betrayal took shape. A row of numbers showed how dishwashers, janitors, and line cooks had lost rewards year after year. Another sheet laid out executive incentives rising at the same pace those cuts were made. Ethan's stomach dropped. He felt as if he had swallowed something bitter, something that wouldn't settle. He pressed his palms against the desk and asked Tom how long this had been going on. Tom hesitated, eyes falling to the floor, and admitted it had started years back when Victoria began tightening budgets under the banner of performance efficiency. That phrase alone made Ethan's jaw clench. Hearing it from a loyal employee forced him to face the depth of the deception, and the hurt inside him wasn't just anger at the executives. It was disappointment in himself for trusting metrics without walking the floors where real people worked. A silence stretched between them, and then Ethan whispered that Maya would never treat people like numbers. For a moment, her kindness flashed across his mind, and that memory made what he was reading feel even heavier. A normal waitress in a small diner had shown more leadership and fairness than the people running his multi-million-dollar teams. Moments like this remind a lot of people listening that sometimes the truth doesn't hurt because it's loud, but because it shows how long something real was ignored. Many who hear stories like this feel that same mix of frustration and hope, knowing others out there have gone through similar disappointing situations. Sharing those reactions in the comments helps everyone feel less alone, and it builds a little community of people who understand what honesty and courage cost. Ethan closed another document, shaking his head slowly. Tom explained that he had tried to push for fairer evaluations, but each time Victoria shut him down, calling the changes unnecessary expenses. Ethan could hear the defeat in Tom's voice, and something shifted between them. He reached out, thanked him sincerely for speaking up, and said that this was the kind of integrity the company should have been built on. Tom nodded, eyes glistening a little, as though he hadn't expected any kindness after admitting his part in the silence. That moment didn't fix years of damage, but it created a bridge, a small piece of harmony between them that hadn't existed before. Still, the weight of the documents lingered in Ethan's mind. They were only scratching the surface, and already the corruption felt enormous. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, then looked at the drive full of files still unopened. Another question took shape in his mind, one that carried both fear and responsibility. If he confronted this system fully, could he stop it without tearing everything down? Or would the truth burn more than just the lies? The uncertainty hung over him, pushing him forward toward answers he wasn't sure he was ready for. Ethan rubbed his eyes as another file finished loading, the room lit only by the glow of the monitor. Everything he and Tom had uncovered so far had been numbers, forms, rerouted budgets, altered documents, but now Ethan felt a deeper pull, something telling him that if the truth really was being hidden, there had to be visual proof somewhere. Tom sat beside him, quieter than before, almost bracing himself. Ethan typed in a few restricted commands he rarely used, and suddenly a new list appeared on the screen, a series of internal surveillance clips tied to staff evaluations. His heart thumped once, hard, because the only reason footage would be stored with evaluations was if someone needed leverage or control. Tom pointed to one file with a timestamp from months ago. Ethan clicked it open, and the moment the video began to play, the air in the room tightened. They watched a supervisor enter a small conference room with a stack of genuine employee feedback sheets. A moment later, Victoria walked in, her voice calm, smooth and cold, as she told him to rewrite anything that made the company look unstable. She said they needed to tighten the culture narrative, and if a few negative experiences disappeared along the way, it was for the good of the enterprise. Hearing her say those words sent a flash of outrage through Ethan, sharper than anything he had felt all morning. Tom swallowed hard and admitted that he had been in meetings just like that, pressured to follow the same script, afraid of losing the job he had held for years. Ethan looked at him, and instead of anger at Tom, he felt a quiet recognition. People under pressure make choices they regret, but choosing honesty now mattered more. Ethan told him that stepping forward took courage, especially when the truth exposed powerful people, and Tom nodded with gratitude, his voice steadier than before as he said he didn't want to hide anymore. Ethan clicked through more videos, watching supervisors get coached on how to twist ratings, so workers who needed bonuses the most were ranked just low enough to disqualify them. Each clip made his chest burn hotter. This wasn't incompetence, it was strategy. A strategy built to control costs at the expense of the people doing the hardest work. Every new angle of the truth hit him harder, because Maya's kindness still lingered in his mind, reminding him that fairness didn't need money or meetings, it needed heart, and somewhere along the way his company had lost that. With shaking hands, Ethan reached for an external device and slid it into the port. Tom looked at him with a mix of fear and hope, understanding exactly what Ethan was doing without a word spoken. Ethan began copying the files one by one, knowing that once they were saved, the truth could not be hidden again. Tom whispered that this would change everything, and Ethan said he knew, but they couldn't keep pretending. His voice carried a kind of clarity he hadn't had in years. It wasn't just anger anymore, it was purpose. Moments like these have a way of returning later with even more force, and the weight of the choices being made right now will shape everything that comes next. It's the kind of turning point that people think about long after the story is over, because one decision here sends ripples through every corner of what's still hidden ahead. Just as the final file finished copying, an alert flashed on the screen. Someone else was trying to access the same restricted archive. Ethan's pulse jumped. Tom leaned closer, whispering that only a handful of executives had that level of clearance. The name appeared for a split second, and both men froze. Victoria. She wasn't just monitoring reports, she was watching the system itself. Ethan clicked the drive safely out of the port and slipped it into his pocket, his mind racing. Questions piled up, heavy and urgent. If she saw movement in the restricted folders, would she know it was him? Would she try to stop him before he could bring the truth forward? And deeper still, could he expose this without tearing apart the company he built from nothing? He didn't have the answer, but he knew the path ahead had changed forever, and turning back was no longer possible. Ethan felt the air shift before he even turned around, the kind of heavy quiet that settles when someone walks in carrying a storm behind their eyes. Victoria stood in the doorway, her heels silent on the carpet, her expression calm in a way that made every hair on his arms rise. She didn't ask what he was doing. She didn't need to. Her gaze slid across the open files on his desk, the drive tucked into his pocket, the frozen frame of a paused video still glowing on the screen. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Ethan could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation, the soft click of a keyboard somewhere down the hall, the pressure of everything he had discovered pushing against his ribs like he couldn't take a full breath. When Victoria finally walked closer, her smile was thin and almost sympathetic, like she was addressing someone who had already lost the battle. She said he was too emotional to lead, her voice gentle the way someone might speak to a child who doesn't understand the world yet. She claimed he was grasping at shadows, that the files he was looking at were taken out of context, that he was letting personal feelings cloud professional judgment. Each sentence felt like a soft slap, delivered with precision. Ethan tried to steady his breathing, but her words dug deeper when she mentioned legal consequences, reminding him of clauses he had signed years ago. She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret, and warned that if he kept digging, the board would have no choice but to review his fitness as CEO. Hearing that struck him harder than he expected. He wasn't just being challenged, he was being boxed in. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. Her strength came from knowing others feared her, knowing people like Tom had stayed silent, because challenging her came with a price they couldn't afford. Ethan felt vulnerability rise like heat in his chest, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he should defend himself or stay quiet. He thought of the employees who trusted the system he built, the workers who relied on bonuses that never came, and the way Maya had carried that tiny tip to the night crew jar with such simple honesty. That memory steadied him. He met Victoria's gaze and told her he wasn't emotional. He was aware. Her expression changed for the first time, a tiny flicker of irritation breaking through her polite calm. She reminded him that leadership required stability, not sentimental reactions to isolated issues. But the footage playing behind her wasn't isolated. It was truth, staring both of them in the face. Tom appeared at the doorway, stopping short when he saw Victoria. His shoulders stiffened and the silence between the three of them grew tight enough to snap. Victoria turned slightly, her voice sharpening as she said some employees were spreading misinformation, and that would be addressed too. Ethan watched Tom's eyes drop, and guilt flickered through him for dragging Tom further into danger. Still, Tom's presence gave him a spark of courage he didn't expect. Gratitude mixed with fear, but it pushed him to take a small step forward, telling Victoria he planned to finish reviewing the files. Her smile faded entirely then, and she tapped something on her phone with practiced ease. Within seconds, the screen in front of him flickered. A notification appeared, red and cold. Access denied. Then another, and another. His permissions were disappearing one by one. Victoria didn't even look at the screen. She already knew what was happening. She said it was for security purposes, to protect the company from misinterpretation of sensitive material. Ethan's stomach dropped as the full weight of the situation hit him. He was being cut off inside his own empire, isolated in a space he once controlled. Leaders who used to greet him warmly would distance themselves now, terrified of being associated with whatever conflict Victoria was preparing to ignite. Everything familiar suddenly felt unsafe, like he was walking through halls that could close in at any moment. Tom stepped toward him slightly, worry in his eyes, and asked if he was all right. Ethan nodded, though his chest felt tight and his throat thick. He wasn't all right, not even close, but he couldn't show that now. He remembered the drive in his pocket, the only piece of truth still within his reach. That thought gave him a small, fragile strength. Victoria took a slow breath and told him to step back from the matter before things became irreversible. The word echoed inside him, twisting into something he couldn't ignore. Irreversible, like a warning, like a threat, and yet, like a line he knew he was meant to cross. She left the office as quietly as she had entered, her perfume lingering in the air, and the moment she disappeared around the corner, Ethan sank into his chair. He covered his face with his hands, feeling the weight of everything pressing down. Panic fluttered at the edges of his mind, but underneath it was something steadier, something growing. He knew he was alone for now. He knew the road ahead could tear everything apart. But he also knew what he had seen, what Maya had unknowingly reminded him of, and what kind of leader he refused to become. The files were gone, but the truth wasn't, not as long as he held the copy close. All that remained was deciding whether he would retreat to keep himself safe or risk everything to make things right. And even in the confusion clouding his thoughts, the answer was starting to take shape. Ethan sat alone in the conference room, a place that usually felt like the center of his power, yet now it felt colder than any empty street at night. The long table stretched out in front of him, like a reminder of every decision he had ever made, every trust he had placed, every blind spot he had ignored. The quiet hum of the air conditioner filled the silence, and the soft glow of the screen in front of him cast a pale light across his face. He opened the diner video again, the one he had watched already more times than he wanted to admit. Maya's gentle voice echoed through the room as she placed that tiny tip into the night crew jar, the gesture so simple yet so full of meaning that it felt like a punch to his chest. He leaned back in his chair, letting the image sink into him. That kind of honesty, that kind of heart, was everything he had hoped his company represented. And seeing the gap between her integrity and the lies running through his own organization made him feel like the ground beneath him was breaking apart. The thought of the board loomed over him like a looming shadow. They could remove him. They could turn his entire life upside down for daring to expose what had been happening behind the scenes. He knew Victoria would twist the narrative, painting him as unstable, emotional, unfit. He could already hear the voices of those who once praised him, shifting to whispers, questioning his judgment. The weight of it pressed on his chest, making it hard to breathe for a moment. But as he stared at Maya's quiet act of kindness, something new rose inside him. It wasn't anger this time. It was resolve, slow but growing, steady like a flame refusing to go out. He whispered a small thank you under his breath, not to anyone in the room, but to the woman in the video who didn't even know she had just shifted the entire direction of his life. He reached for the external drive he had slipped into his pocket earlier. Holding it in his hand, he felt the importance of it, the truth it carried, the proof that everything he suspected was real. He placed it on the table and began organizing all the documents he had gathered, piecing together the story of corruption, lies, and manipulation that Victoria had woven into the company culture. Each file added another piece to the puzzle, and with every new detail, he felt the sting of betrayal soften slightly, replaced by something more focused. The betrayal still hurt, but it was no longer holding him in place. It was pushing him forward. Tom entered briefly, checking if Ethan needed anything, and Ethan offered a quiet nod of gratitude that held more weight than words. They weren't just manager and CEO anymore. They were two people choosing to do the right thing after realizing how much the truth mattered. As the afternoon sun shifted through the blinds, marking the slow passing of hours, Ethan's work grew more determined. Papers spread across the table, evidence sorted into clear threads that even the board wouldn't be able to deny. He could feel the fear sitting next to him, but he didn't let it steer him. Instead, he let Maya's simple kindness remind him why he started the company in the first place, back when he believed a workplace could actually make people feel valued. The crisis pressed down on him from every direction, whispering that he could lose everything, yet he kept going. He knew he had to walk into the next phase with more than anger. He had to walk in with truth, clarity, and purpose, and for the first time in a long while, he felt those things taking shape inside him again. He gathered the files into a single folder on the desk and rested his hand on top of it. This was the case he would bring forward, the one that could redeem the company or tear it apart. He wasn't sure yet which outcome would come first, but he knew stepping back was no longer possible. The decision felt solid, like something carved into stone. He took a slow breath and let the moment settle, the silence now filled with a quiet bravery instead of fear. Moments like these always get people thinking, wondering what they would do if everything they built was suddenly at risk. Would they step back or stand up for what's right, even when it's dangerous? If you feel something about this moment, share it in the comments, subscribe, and keep following these stories, because every voice here helps keep this space alive. Ethan looked out the window, the city stretching far below, unaware of the storm about to break. He whispered one last promise to himself, a simple sentence that held all the weight of what was coming. This time he wouldn't run from the truth. He would carry it, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. Ethan returned to his office long before sunrise, the building still half asleep, lights dim and hallways silent, except for the steady hum of the vents pushing warm air through the empty floors. He carried a folder under his arm and the small external drive in his pocket, holding it like someone who understood exactly how fragile and powerful truth could be. The weight of everything that happened the day before was still heavy in his chest, but something inside him had settled. It was the feeling that comes right after fear stops controlling the steps, when a person finally chooses a direction and decides not to look back. He sat down at the table, spread out all the evidence he had gathered, and breathed deeply, as if preparing for a marathon he never trained for but could no longer avoid. The quiet around him helped him focus, and for the first time since the whole nightmare started, he felt the shape of a plan forming clearly, instead of chaos moving in circles inside his head. He turned on his laptop and called the legal advisors he trusted most, men and women who had seen the company grow from a messy dream into a giant that touched thousands of lives. Their faces appeared on the screen with surprise, but they listened closely as he explained everything he had uncovered, showing them documents, emails, and the footage that had shaken him at his core. They asked questions, lots of them, the kind meant to test if he understood the risks, if he realized what it meant to confront not only Victoria, but the entire structure she had built around herself. He answered each one with a quiet voice, but with a steadiness that surprised even him. When the call ended, one advisor stayed behind a moment longer and told him that courage sometimes sounds exactly like what he had just said. Those words stayed with him like a warm hand on his shoulder in a cold room. A few hours later, Tom walked in, holding a small stack of papers against his chest, gripping them with both hands as if afraid they might slip away. He closed the door behind him and said he found old emails stored on a forgotten server backup, messages that showed exactly how Victoria instructed managers to rewrite evaluations. His voice carried fear, but also something stronger, something close to relief. He apologized again for staying quiet in the past, and this time Ethan walked around the table and placed a hand on his shoulder, thanking him sincerely. He told him that honesty now mattered more than mistakes made before, and Tom nodded with a faint smile that showed how much he needed to hear that. The two of them sat together again, reading through every line of the emails, and each one pulled the curtain back a little further, revealing a pattern so intentional that neither of them could deny the scale of what they were confronting. The sun rose slowly outside the windows, painting the city gold, and as the light filled the room, it made everything look sharper, more real. Ethan gathered every piece of evidence into a single organized file, printed key pages, backed up copies in 2 different drives, and prepared notes for the meeting that would decide the future of the company. He knew Victoria would not sit quietly. She would twist the story, question his stability, and make him look reckless in front of the board. He expected every angle of resistance, every attempt to turn fear against him. But now, holding the truth in his hands, he also knew he could not stay silent. Silence was what allowed the problem to grow in the first place. So he packed everything into his briefcase, straightened his jacket, and looked at his reflection in the dark screen of the laptop. The man looking back was tired, yes, but there was something else in his eyes, a fire that had been missing for far too long. He walked toward the boardroom, each step echoing through the empty hallway like the countdown to something big. His palms were warm, not from fear but from the adrenaline that comes before confronting someone who has already tried to take everything from him. He stopped outside the door for a moment, breathing slowly to steady himself. Behind that door were people who could destroy his career, question his sanity, or even remove him from the company he built. But inside that same room was also the chance to reclaim everything the wrong way had taken from the workers who trusted him. He tightened his grip on the briefcase, feeling the edges press into his hand like a reminder that truth always comes with weight. Before he pushed the door open, a thought crossed his mind, the kind that makes anyone stop for a second. When someone reaches a moment like this, do they choose the safe road and protect themselves, or the hard one that protects others, even if it costs everything they have built? Would you have the courage to walk through a door like this? If that question hits you, pause a moment and leave a comment so others can reflect with you. He stepped into the room. The board members turned their heads as the door clicked shut behind him. Some faces showed confusion, others concern. A few simply blank because they knew drama usually came with consequences they didn't want to share. Ethan placed the briefcase on the table, opened it slowly, and pulled out the folder with the evidence. The papers looked ordinary, but the silence that fell over the room made them feel like they were made of glass, ready to break something wide open. He glanced briefly at the empty chair Victoria usually sat in and felt a cold shiver pass through him. She wasn't there yet, but she would arrive soon, and when she did, everything would shift. He took his seat with a steady breath, preparing himself for the confrontation he knew was coming. What was at stake wasn't just his reputation or his title. It was the heart of the company itself, everything it claimed to be but failed to live up to. He folded his hands together and waited as footsteps approached from down the hall. His heartbeat slowed, not with fear, but with something steadier, something stronger than the weight pressing down on him. The door began to open again, and he lifted his eyes to meet whatever came next, fully aware that one wrong move could change everything, but also fully ready to face it. Determination settled in his chest, like a final piece locking into place. Below all the tension, all the risk, all the fear, he felt one truth rising clearly. He wasn't stepping into this fight alone. He was stepping into it finally aligned with the person he always meant to be. The moment Victoria entered the boardroom, the air shifted as if someone had pulled a tight string across the center of the table. She walked in with calm steps, the kind that came from knowing exactly how much power she held and how willing she was to use it. Her eyes locked onto Ethan for a second, long enough to send a silent warning, before she turned toward the board with a warm smile that did not reach her eyes. She began speaking before anyone even asked her to, launching into a polished speech about company stability, leadership responsibility, and the dangers of allowing personal emotions to interfere with executive judgment. Each word slid smoothly across the table, building the picture she wanted them to see, one where Ethan had lost perspective, where he had become unpredictable, where his recent behavior posed a threat to the business. Some board members shifted in their seats, confused, others leaning forward unsure of what they were walking into. Ethan watched quietly, allowing her to paint her scene without interrupting. He knew that silence was his power now. Let her talk. Every lie she spoke would make the truth hit harder when it finally came. Victoria went on, describing him as unstable, saying he had accessed restricted files without approval, implying he had violated confidentiality agreements. She framed his actions as reckless curiosity rather than responsible leadership. The room felt colder with every sentence she added. A couple of board members exchanged glances that made Ethan's stomach twist. He could almost see how easily they wanted to believe her story, because believing her meant the company was fine, the systems were fine, the culture was fine. Believing her meant they didn't have to face the uncomfortable truth that something rotten had been growing right under their watch. Victoria finally ended by saying she worried about Ethan's judgment and that the board needed to make a hard decision before bigger damage occurred. Her tone dripped with false concern, and for a moment the silence afterward felt like a drop of water hitting hot metal. Ethan stood slowly, not reacting to her accusations, not raising his voice or matching her intensity. He simply thanked her for sharing her perspective, and then he opened his briefcase. The sound of the latch releasing echoed through the room in a way that made several people straighten in their chairs. He laid out the documents first, one after another in neat rows that showed the numbers clearly. He explained the altered bonuses, the missing funds, the manipulated evaluations. He spoke calmly, but each word carried weight. Then he pulled up the footage on the large display, and the room fell completely silent. Victoria's voice came through the speakers, crisp and unmistakable, telling supervisors to rewrite real feedback and tighten the culture narrative. There was no way to argue context or misunderstanding. The video spoke louder than anything Ethan could say. A few board members froze, others leaned back as if distance could protect them from the truth. Victoria's face drained slightly, only for a moment, but Ethan saw it. Fear. Not loud fear, but the quiet kind that comes when someone realizes the ground is slipping under them. She tried to speak, but the board cut her off. One member asked how long this had been happening. Another asked why bonuses disappeared without explanation. A third member stared straight at Victoria and asked why she claimed everything was fine when the footage clearly showed manipulation. The balance of the room started to shift, the weight of judgment sliding away from Ethan and landing firmly on her shoulders. Ethan felt something rise inside him, not pride, not relief, but a kind of justice, waking up after a long sleep. His hands were steady as he answered questions, his voice even, and the more he spoke, the clearer the board's faces became. They weren't fooled anymore. They saw what he saw. They understood what he carried in with him today. When the footage ended, Ethan added Tom's testimony, reading from the emails Tom had uncovered. The messages confirmed everything. The pressure, the rewriting, the quiet removal of rewards. Board members exchanged looks, confused and angry, and the room felt like it had cracked open. Victoria tried to defend herself, saying the videos were taken out of context, the emails misunderstood, that she was protecting the company's image, but her voice shook just enough for everyone to notice. No one interrupted her now out of respect. They let her speak, because her words only made the truth clearer. Then Ethan said a sentence that made the entire room pause. He said that leadership is not about hiding problems but facing them, and that courage comes from honesty, even when the truth hurts. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It settled into the room like a weight everyone felt at the same time. Moments like that often land in people's hearts in a way that goes beyond the story itself. Somewhere out there, someone listening remembers a moment when honesty finally broke through a wall of lies. And someone else remembers standing alone before a room full of power. These shared feelings create a strange unity, like different lives touching at the same point in time without ever meeting. The board's questions turned sharper. The calm tone in the room shifted into something tense, something close to disbelief mixed with betrayal. Victoria's grip on control weakened with every minute, and everyone could see it. Ethan stayed steady, not attacking, not gloating, just standing with the truth in his hands. It changed the energy in the room, making him look stronger than he felt inside. One board member finally said they could not ignore what they had seen. Another said the company needed transparency, not manipulation. Victoria tried once more to turn the accusation back on him, saying he was trying to destroy her career for personal revenge, but no one listened. The swing had happened. The turning point had arrived. The board wasn't on her side anymore. Ethan exhaled slowly as the chairperson announced they needed a private discussion before taking official action. Victoria's eyes met his one last time, filled with a mixture of anger and fear, and for the first time since this started, Ethan felt the shift inside himself. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't defenseless. He had walked into this room carrying fear, truth and purpose all at once, and now only the truth remained standing with him. He picked up his folder, ignoring the cold tension spreading behind him as Victoria stepped aside. What came next would decide the fate of everything he built, but for the first time in a long time, he walked out feeling lighter, as if vindication had begun to take root inside him, steady and warm, ready for whatever the next confrontation demanded. When Ethan stepped back into the boardroom after the short recess, the atmosphere felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves had listened to everything and were waiting for the final blow to land. The board members sat in a tight semicircle, papers spread out before them, eyes lowered in deep thought. Victoria stood near the far end of the table, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her jaw tense, a faint tremble running through the perfectly controlled mask she usually wore. She looked smaller than before, not in size but in certainty, like someone who finally realized the ground beneath them was not as solid as they believed. Ethan walked to his seat slowly, every step steady, carrying the same quiet determination he brought with him earlier. The chairperson looked up at him with a calm, grave expression, and Ethan understood immediately that something important had shifted while he was gone. The chairperson cleared his throat and began to speak in a tone that left no room for confusion. He said the evidence presented was undeniable, that the emails, the footage, and the financial trail all aligned in a way that could no longer be explained as administrative mistakes or isolated decisions. He spoke about leadership and integrity, about the responsibility leaders have to the people who make the company stand every day. Ethan listened, not with pride but with a weight in his chest, because hearing the truth laid out so clearly made him feel both relieved and responsible at the same time. Victoria tried to interrupt, insisting there were explanations, insisting context was missing, insisting her actions were misinterpreted, but the board no longer reacted with interest. Their eyes were firm, and their silence said more than words could have. Finally, one board member looked directly at Victoria and asked why she hadn't disclosed any of the changes she made to evaluation processes. Another asked how she justified removing bonuses from workers who had earned them. A third asked why she ever instructed supervisors to hide negative feedback instead of addressing the problems at their root. Victoria tried to speak, but her voice cracked slightly, and her answers came out sharp and brittle instead of polished. She blamed department heads, she blamed outdated systems, she blamed miscommunication anyone except herself. Each weak excuse seemed to shrink her a little more. Ethan could see the realization hitting her piece by piece that her control over the narrative had truly slipped away. Then the decisive moment arrived. The chairperson announced that until a full investigation was completed, Victoria was suspended from all her duties effective immediately. She stood perfectly still at first, as if trying to understand whether she had heard correctly. Then her eyes darted to Ethan, filled with a mix of anger, fear, and something close to disbelief. She stepped forward, saying the board was making a mistake, that the company would fall apart without her. But the board calmly repeated the decision. The truth had cornered her completely. There was no place left for her to redirect the blame. Ethan watched her gather her things with stiff movements, her hands shaking as she placed her phone inside her bag. She didn't look at anyone again as she walked out, and the quiet click of the door closing behind her felt like the final note of a storm breaking. For a long moment no one spoke. The room felt lighter, yet full of the weight of what had unfolded. Ethan felt relief, yes, but not triumph. What filled him most was a sense of responsibility rising inside him, the awareness that the hard part wasn't just exposing what was wrong. The real work was rebuilding what those lies had broken, and that work started now. The chairperson turned to him with a thoughtful expression and said the company needed honest leadership moving forward, someone able to rebuild trust from the ground up. Ethan nodded slowly, feeling the truth of those words settle deep inside him. He wasn't the same leader he had been before this crisis. Something had changed in the way he saw people, in the way he valued simple gestures, in the way he understood responsibility. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to walk it with clarity. Later that day, when the building grew calmer and the shock of the morning began to fade, Ethan walked through the halls alone. Every step reminded him that the decisions made today would echo into tomorrow, and the consequences, good or painful, would come back with force. But he also felt that the next steps would tie everything together in ways he couldn't yet see, guiding him towards something larger than the fight he had just survived. He returned to his office and closed the door quietly. The chair where Victoria once sat during meetings stood empty, and seeing it like that made him pause. It wasn't just her downfall that mattered. It was the vacuum of power left behind, the space where something better could finally be built. He sat down and opened his laptop, looking again at the faces of workers in evaluation files, remembering the stress in their eyes, the hope in their performance comments, the trust they had placed in a system that failed them. He thought of Maya again, of her sincere smile and the way she carried that tip with tenderness. Her kindness had become a spark in his mind, something that kept guiding him toward the leader he wanted to be. He whispered quietly into the empty room that things would change now, not because of punishment or fear, but because people deserved honesty. He reached for a notepad and wrote down the first steps he would take to rebuild the culture, simple ideas rooted in fairness and transparency. Each word steadied him more, like pieces of himself settling back into place after being shaken apart. And as he lifted his eyes toward the window, watching sunlight fade into evening, a feeling washed over him. Hope, heavy, but real. Hope that carried the weight of everything he had seen and still shined through. The next chapter was waiting, and he was ready to step into it. Ethan walked into his office the next morning with a different kind of weight in his chest. Not the crushing pressure that had followed him for weeks, but a quieter, warmer heaviness that came from knowing change was finally possible. The board had made their decision. Victoria was suspended, and for the first time the company felt open, like fresh air had finally entered a room that had been shut for far too long. Still, when he sat down at his desk, the responsibility settled across his shoulders in a way that made his breath deepen. He wasn't just fixing numbers or cleaning up someone else's mess. He was rebuilding something people lived inside every day. He looked at the folder of evidence one last time before closing it gently. That chapter was ending. Now he had to build the next one with honesty, leading him instead of fear. He called the department heads into a meeting and talked to them with a sincerity they hadn't heard from him in years. His voice shook slightly at first, not from weakness, but from the truth finally coming through. He explained the new reward system he wanted to create, one built on transparency. Bonuses would no longer disappear without explanation, and evaluations would be tied to real work, not manipulated numbers. People who cleaned floors, carried boxes, washed dishes, and kept the company running would be seen and valued. For a moment, the room was silent as they absorbed the weight of what he was saying. Then someone nodded. Another wiped their eyes quietly. A third leaned forward as if seeing Ethan for the first time. Gratitude wasn't loud in that room. It showed in softened faces, in steadier breathing, in shoulders lowering as if a burden they didn't know they carried had been lifted. Ethan felt something inside him shift again, something that made him stand taller. Later that afternoon he drove back to the diner, the place where everything had started. The familiar bell over the door chimed softly as he stepped inside, and the smell of coffee and warm bread wrapped around him like a memory. Maya was behind the counter tying her apron, and when she saw him, she smiled with the same gentle honesty that had changed his life. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as he walked toward her. He thanked her for a simple act she didn't even remember doing, the tip she put in the night crew jar. She looked surprised, then touched, her eyes softening as she realized how much that tiny gesture had meant. He told her the truth, all of it, carefully and without hiding anything. She listened quietly, her gaze steady, her hands clasped in front of her. She didn't say much at first, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, like she understood in her bones what honesty could spark in someone's life. When she finally spoke, her voice was warm. She said, "People work better when they feel seen, when they believe someone cares." That simple sentence hit him with the same power it had at the diner counter weeks ago. He asked if she would help him build the company he always dreamed of, one where kindness wasn't an accident but a rule. Maya blinked, stunned, and then nodded slowly. She wasn't a lawyer or a manager or someone with a polished resume, but she had something the company had lost: heart. He offered her a consulting role to help design transparent policies from the workers' point of view, and the way her eyes brightened made something inside his chest loosen. For the first time since this all began, he felt not only hope but calm, the feeling that comes when someone chooses to walk with you instead of watching from a distance. They sat together at a small corner booth, papers spread between coffee cups. Maya suggested simple changes that seemed so obvious once she said them: clear explanations for evaluations, direct communication about bonus structures, anonymous feedback channels that couldn't be rewritten. monthly recognition moments for night crews, janitors, and anyone whose work stayed in the shadows. Ethan wrote down every idea as carefully as if they were priceless instructions, because to him, they were. As they talked, he could almost see the new company forming, layer by layer, shaped by truth instead of image. The warmth in the diner felt different now, like it was flowing through him, guiding each word and decision. When Ethan stood to leave, the sun was setting outside, casting orange light across the tables. He looked at Maya and told her she had done more than she knew. She smiled, a small, humble smile that made his chest fill with something close to gratitude and admiration tangled together. He stepped outside and breathed in the cool evening air, feeling the weight of the past weeks fade into something softer. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning of rebuilding. Not just a company, but the belief that people mattered more than numbers. He walked toward his car with a calm determination spreading through him, feeling the moment settle deep inside like a promise being sealed. As he glanced back at the diner window, seeing Maya wiping down a counter with the same gentle care she had always shown, he realized he was standing one step away from the final resolution. The hardest battles were behind him, but the truest challenge was still ahead, proving that honesty could hold an empire together better than fear ever did. And with that thought steadying his breath, he knew exactly where he needed to go next. Ethan stood at the front of the auditorium, facing rows of employees who had gathered with looks ranging from cautious hope to quiet doubt. The stage lights warmed his face, but what warmed him more was knowing why he was there. Knowing what he was about to say would change everything about how the company breathed and treated its people. He took a slow breath, letting the calm settle in his chest, and then he began speaking in a voice steadier than he thought he had left inside him. He told them about the new reward system, explained how every evaluation would be open, how bonuses would be tied to real work and not hidden behind closed doors, and how every department would have a direct line to speak out without fear of being silenced. He wasn't reading from a script. He was speaking from the heart, because this time the changes came from what he had witnessed, not from a boardroom conversation. Faces across the room softened little by little, not with instant trust, but with the possibility of it, and that was enough to make his voice grow warmer as he continued. As he finished the main announcement, he lifted the diner jar he had placed on the podium earlier, the same kind Maya had used when she believed no one was watching. He explained its story without naming her, keeping her privacy protected but honoring her kindness. He said the jar reminded him of the value of unseen work, of gestures that hold the weight of real culture, the kind that never makes it onto a spreadsheet and never asks for applause. People leaned forward, some with tears in their eyes, some with quiet smiles, and the room held a silence that felt like understanding taking root. When he placed the jar back down, it felt almost like setting a compass for everyone in the building. After the meeting, workers approached him with grateful handshakes and honest smiles, and he shook each hand with a sincerity he didn't even know he could show before all of this. He walked through the building afterward, passing groups of employees talking with a different kind of energy, lighter, freer. The halls that once felt heavy now felt like they were opening, like hope was spreading through the walls in a steady pulse. When he finally returned to his office, Maya was already waiting for him on a video call, smiling shyly from the diner kitchen where she had taken a short break. She asked how it went, and he told her the truth, that it went better than he expected because people understood what honesty meant when it came from the right place. She laughed softly and said she was proud of him, and those words settled deep inside him in a way no corporate award ever had. They spent the next hour going over the last details of the new policies she had helped shape. Her ideas brought life to the paperwork, adding humanity to every line. She didn't speak like a consultant reading from a manual. She spoke like a person who understood people, their struggles, their hope, their exhaustion, their need to feel seen. Ethan wrote down everything she said, feeling that calm strength again, the one that had started growing the moment he stepped back into the diner. When the call ended, he looked at the jar sitting on his shelf, glowing in the soft afternoon light. It felt like a promise, a reminder that leadership wasn't about being above anyone. It was about standing with them, about seeing them fully even when the world didn't. Later that week, he walked through the company floor, watching managers gather their teams to explain the changes. There was confusion, yes, but also relief, and most of all gratitude. A few employees approached him shyly, thanking him for finally addressing issues they had lived with quietly for years. He listened to each one, letting their stories sink into him. He wasn't just fixing spreadsheets, he was repairing trust, And trust, he realized, had its own kind of weight, heavier but more meaningful than any report or budget line. Ethan ended that long day alone in his office, leaning back in his chair with the window open behind him. The city lights flickered outside like small reminders that life kept moving, and inside his chest there was a fullness he hadn't felt in years. He looked at the jar again and whispered that sometimes a tiny act, something as small as a $7 meal and a few coins of gratitude, could change the direction of an entire empire. The thought brought a soft smile to his face. He knew not every day would be easy from here on out, but he also knew he wasn't walking the hard days alone. He had Maya's guidance, Tom's courage, and a workforce that could finally breathe again. That was enough to carry him forward. When he turned off the lights and walked out, he paused for a moment in the doorway, taking one last look at the jar glowing gently in the dusk. It stood there, like a quiet guardian of everything he wanted to protect, and as he walked down the hall, the feeling that followed him wasn't fear or regret. It was the warm certainty that he had become the leader he always hoped to be, the kind who never forgets the unseen hands holding the company together. It was worth everything it took to get here, every risk, every late night, every moment of doubt. It was worth staying in the fight until the very end. Before you go, let me ask you something deep. If you were in Ethan's place, would you have had the courage to rebuild everything from the ground up just to protect people who trusted you? Do you think he made the right choice? And what about you in your own life? What small jar moment could change everything? Pause for a second and share your thoughts, because your voice matters in stories like this. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Drop your first and last name in the comments to show you made it here. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and come back for more stories. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. And if this one touched you because it showed how a simple act of honesty can reshape a whole life, then the next story will shake you even more, because it dives even deeper into what people hide behind everyday moments.